May 13th, 1943. The death charge explodes 15 meters from the hull. Steel screams. Light bulbs shatter into 1,000 pieces. 44 German sailors are thrown against metal walls as their submarine pitches violently sideways. Water begins pouring through cracked seams. The captain screams orders, but his voice is drowned by the second explosion, this one directly beneath them, lifting the entire stern like a toy in a bathtub. Kapitän Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Hesse grips the periscope housing, watching his men scramble in the red emergency lighting. 30 seconds ago, they were safe. 30 seconds ago, the Atlantic night was their sanctuary. Then light appeared from nowhere. Brilliant, blinding, impossible light that turned midnight into noon, exposing every rivet of U-640's hull to an aircraft that should not exist. Here is a statistic that will haunt you. Between 1940 and early 1943, German U-boats sank over 14 million tons of Allied shipping. They killed 30,000 British merchant sailors. They came within months of starving Britain into surrender. And they did it all by following one simple rule that had worked perfectly for 3 years of total war. Surface at night. Charge your batteries. Hunt in darkness. The Allies own the day, but the night belongs to the U-boat. That rule was about to be shattered by a man who was not a scientist, not a general, not even a combat pilot. He was a 53-year-old administrative officer who had spent most of his career pushing papers and attending meetings. A man whose idea was called ridiculous, impossible, a waste of resources by nearly everyone who heard it. His name was Humphrey de Leigh, and his invention would kill more German submariners than any single weapon system of the war. By the end of this story, you will learn how one stubborn officer with no engineering degree created a device that sank 43 confirmed U-boats, damaged nearly 100 more, and fundamentally reversed the most critical battle of World War II. You will learn how 24 million candle power changed the mathematics of survival in the Atlantic. And you will understand why German submarine commanders began calling the Bay of Biscay the Valley of Death. But first, you need to understand why Britain was dying in 1941. Britain is an island. This geographic fact, which had protected the nation from invasion for centuries, became its greatest vulnerability in total war. The British Isles produced only 40% of the food its population consumed. It produced virtually none of its own oil. Every tank, every aircraft, every bullet fired by British forces required raw materials shipped across the Atlantic from America, Canada, and the colonies. Winston Churchill understood this reality with terrifying clarity. He later wrote that the U-boat menace was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war. Not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion. The submarines. The numbers tell the story. In 1940, German U-boats operating from newly captured French ports sank 4 million tons of Allied shipping. Crews called this period die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. U-boat captains became celebrities in Germany. Some sank over 200,000 tons individually, earning Knight's Crosses and national fame. The mathematics were brutal. Britain needed to import 1 million tons of supplies weekly to survive. Germany needed to sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them. In 1941, this equation tilted toward Germany. U-boats were sinking ships at 3 times the replacement rate. The problem was not lack of effort. The Royal Navy deployed hundreds of destroyers and corvettes to escort convoys. Coastal Command flew thousands of patrol missions over the Atlantic and Bay of Biscay. Scientists developed radar systems that could detect surfaced submarines from miles away. But none of it mattered at night. Here is the tactical reality that governed submarine warfare in 1941. A Type 7C U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, carried batteries that provided approximately 16 hours of submerged operation at cruising speed. After those 16 hours, the submarine must surface to run its diesel engines and recharge. This process required about 4 hours for full charge. German commanders quickly learned to surface after sunset. At night, without moonlight, a submarine's conning tower was virtually invisible against the dark ocean. British aircraft flew overhead, but they could not see what their eyes could not detect. Radar could find the submarine, but by the time the aircraft closed to attack range, the U-boat had already begun diving. 45 seconds was all it took to get the conning tower underwater. Another minute to reach safe depth. The night was sanctuary. This was not theory. This was proven doctrine, validated by 3 years of combat experience. German submarines spent 60% of their operational time on the surface, hunting convoys at 17 knots, charging batteries in peace, confident that darkness provided perfect protection. Coastal Command faced an impossible problem. Their aircraft could find submarines with radar, but radar could not guide an attack with enough precision to drop depth charges accurately. Aircraft needed visual contact to kill a U-boat, and visual contact at night, in the Atlantic, was essentially impossible. Some nights, aircraft crews flew directly over surfaced submarines without ever seeing them. The U-boat commanders did not even bother to dive. Why waste battery power when the enemy was blind? Britain experimented with flares. They tried dropping illumination rounds that parachuted slowly, casting flickering light over the ocean. The results were useless. Flares took too long to ignite, giving submarines time to dive. The light was uneven, creating shadows that hid targets. Wind scattered the illumination unpredictably. By early 1941, British military planners had essentially accepted that night anti-submarine operations were impossible. The Royal Navy focused on improving convoy escort tactics. Scientists worked on better radar for surface ships. The idea of hunting U-boats at night from aircraft was considered a technical dead end. But one man refused to accept this conclusion. Squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Leigh was 53 years old in 1940. He had joined the Royal Air Force in 1915 during the First World War, flying reconnaissance missions over the Western Front. By 1940, he had transitioned to administrative and technical staff positions, the kind of desk work that keeps military organizations functioning, but rarely produces heroes. Leigh was not an engineer by training. He was not a physicist. He had no advanced degrees and no background in optics or electrical systems. What he possessed was something perhaps more valuable. 25 years of thinking about how aircraft could support naval operations. In the interwar years, Leigh had studied maritime patrol problems obsessively. He understood the fundamental challenge of submarine hunting. Detection was possible. Radar worked. But the gap between detection and destruction remained unbridgeable at night. One evening in late 1940, Leigh sat in his office, staring at a simple question he had written on a notepad. What if we brought daylight with us? The idea seemed absurd. Searchlights existed, of course. Massive carbon arc lights were used for anti-aircraft defense and naval operations, but these weighed thousands of pounds. They required generators larger than the aircraft engines themselves. They were mounted on ships in fixed positions, not carried aloft in twin-engine bombers. Leigh began researching. He learned that 24 million candle power would illuminate a submarine clearly from 3,000 feet, the typical depth charge release altitude. He calculated the beam spread, the power requirements, the weight tolerances. The numbers were difficult, but not impossible. He approached the RAF establishment with his concept: install a powerful searchlight under the wing of a patrol aircraft. Use radar to guide the approach until approximately 1 mile from target. Then activate the light, illuminate the submarine, and attack with depth charges before it could dive. The reaction was exactly what you would expect. Senior officers called the idea impractical. Engineers said the power requirements would overload aircraft electrical systems. Operating commanders argued that, even if the light worked, the Germans would simply hear aircraft approaching and dive before illumination. The weight would reduce bomb loads and patrol range. Leigh heard every objection. He answered them all. But answers were not enough. The British military establishment in 1941 was fighting for survival on multiple fronts. Resources were desperately scarce. No one wanted to invest in an unproven concept championed by an aging administrative officer. For months, Leigh's proposal gathered dust in committee files. But Humphrey Leigh was not a man who accepted rejection quietly. He began building a prototype with his own hands, using scavenged parts and borrowed equipment. He worked nights and weekends, testing configurations in empty hangars, calculating and recalculating beam angles and power draws. The prototype weighed 450 pounds, complete with mounting hardware. It produced 24 million candle power, focused into a beam visible for 10 miles. It required 24 volts at 120 amperes, which existing aircraft generators could provide with modification. And it could activate to full brightness in less than 2 seconds. Leigh solved the operational problems through engineering. A retractable mount kept the light flush against the wing during normal flight, eliminating drag. Heat-resistant housings prevented fire. Ventilation systems dissipated the intense heat generated by the carbon arc. In late 1941, Leigh finally received permission for official trials. The test was conducted on a moonless night over the English Channel. A British submarine volunteered as target, surfacing at predetermined coordinates. Leigh's aircraft, a modified Wellington bomber, approached using only radar guidance. At 1 mile range, the pilot activated the searchlight. The submarine appeared. Not as a vague shadow, not as a ghostly shape, but as clearly as if photographed at noon. Every detail of the conning tower was visible. The wake streaming behind, the lookouts scrambling for the hatch, the deck gun, the rivets. The pilot had enough time to read identification markings before the submarine completed its crash dive. The observers on shore were stunned. Naval officers who had insisted the concept would fail watched in silence as darkness transformed into illuminated ocean. The beam spread covered approximately half a mile diameter at 3,000 feet altitude. Inside that circle, nothing could hide. The trial results were classified immediately. If German intelligence learned that British aircraft could hunt submarines at night, U-boat commanders would change tactics before the weapon could be deployed operationally. The element of surprise was essential. Through early 1942, the RAF installed Leigh Lights on Wellington bombers assigned to Coastal Command Squadron 172, based at Chivener in North Devon. Crews trained intensively in night attack procedures. Radar operators learned to guide pilots toward contacts they could not see. Pilots practiced the critical 20-second sequence, from light activation to depth charge release. The first operational Leigh Light attack occurred on June 4, 1942. A Wellington caught the Italian submarine Luigi Torelli, surfaced in the Bay of Biscay. The light activated perfectly. The depth charges fell accurately. The submarine was severely damaged and forced to abort its patrol. Within weeks, more attacks followed. U-boats that had surfaced with complete confidence in the protective darkness suddenly found themselves illuminated as clearly as theater stages. Some dove in time. Many did not. By May 1943, Coastal Command had approximately 40 Leigh Light aircraft operational. They had attacked 31 surfaced submarines, achieving confirmed kills on 7 and probable kills on 9 more. The Germans had absolutely no idea what was happening. U-boat commanders filed confused reports describing impossible attacks. Aircraft appearing without warning in complete darkness, searchlights brighter than noon sun, depth charges falling with accuracy that suggested the British could somehow see through night itself. German naval intelligence theorized about infrared detection. They suspected advanced radar. They ordered countermeasures that proved worthless against a weapon they did not understand existed. But even as the Leigh Light proved its devastating effectiveness, a critical question remained. Could the technology scale? Could 40 aircraft hunting occasional submarines actually reverse the Battle of the Atlantic? German shipyards were launching new U-boats faster than ever. Admiral Donitz had over 400 submarines operational. He needed only a few more months of current sinking rates to strangle Britain completely. One device, on a handful of aircraft, had proven it could kill submarines at night. But killing submarines one at a time was not enough. Britain needed to make the entire Atlantic dangerous for U-boats. It needed to transform night from sanctuary into killing ground across millions of square miles of ocean. In Part 2, we will see how Humphrey Lee's invention went from experimental success to industrial weapon. We will watch as entire squadrons deployed with his searchlights, flying over 17,000 patrols in 18 months. We will witness the month of May 1943, when Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, the highest monthly total of the entire war. And we will return to U-640, still diving desperately as depth charges explode around it, to learn whether Kapitänleutnant Hesse and his 44 crewmen survived the light that came from nowhere. The Battle of the Atlantic was about to transform, and the Germans were about to learn that the night no longer belonged to them. In Part 1, you watched a 53-year-old administrative officer named Humphrey Lee create the impossible. A searchlight powerful enough to turn midnight into noon. A weapon that caught German U-boats at 3,000 feet and exposed them like insects under a magnifying glass. You saw the first successful tests. You witnessed submarines that had ruled the Atlantic night, suddenly illuminated and destroyed. But here is what I did not tell you. Between Lee's first successful prototype in 1941 and widespread deployment in 1943, 22 months passed. 22 months during which German U-boats sank over 1,200 Allied ships. 22 months during which 15,000 merchant sailors drowned in the Atlantic. 22 months during which a working weapon sat in warehouses while committees debated and admirals argued. The technology worked. The trials proved it. But Humphrey Lee was about to discover something far more dangerous than German submarines. He was about to fight the British military establishment itself. And this is where everything became worse. The problem was not technical. The Leigh Light functioned exactly as designed. Aircraft equipped with the system successfully illuminated submarines during every test conducted in late 1941. Pilots reported that targets appeared as clearly as photographs. The depth charge accuracy improved dramatically compared to blind attacks. The problem was institutional. Air Chief Marshal Sir Philip Joubert de la Ferte commanded Coastal Command in 1941. He was a competent officer with a distinguished career, but he faced a brutal reality. His command received the lowest priority for aircraft, equipment, and personnel. Bomber Command took the best planes for strategic bombing campaigns against German cities. Fighter Command received priority for home defense. Coastal Command got whatever remained. In this environment of scarcity, every resource allocation decision became political warfare. When Leigh's proposal reached Joubert's desk with a request for aircraft modifications and dedicated squadrons, the response was cautious. The concept was interesting, the staff officers wrote, but implementation would require diverting aircraft from existing patrol duties. It would require training programs. It would require manufacturing capacity already stretched thin. Perhaps, they suggested, the idea could be revisited after the current crisis eased. Leigh requested a meeting. He sat across from a panel of senior officers in a conference room at Coastal Command headquarters. Maps covered the walls, showing U-boat positions and convoy routes. Red pins marked recent sinkings. There were many red pins. Squadron Leader Leigh, one Air Commodore began, "We have reviewed your proposal thoroughly. The technical aspects are impressive. However, we must consider operational realities." "Sir," Leigh replied, "every night we delay, German submarines surface with complete impunity. They charge batteries. They hunt convoys. They kill our sailors. My system works. I have demonstrated it works." The Air Commodore shuffled papers. Yes, the trials were promising. But promising trials do not guarantee operational success. We cannot commit scarce resources to experimental equipment when proven systems require those same resources. Leigh leaned forward. "What proven systems are hunting U-boats at night, sir? Name one." Silence. Another officer spoke. "The matter is also one of priorities. The Air Ministry has determined that long-range bombing of German industrial capacity offers the best strategic return on aircraft investment. Coastal Command's role is defensive. We protect convoys. We do not have the luxury of offensive experimentation." Leigh felt his jaw tighten. "Gentlemen, Britain imports 1 million tons of supplies weekly to survive. In the past month, U-boats have sunk enough shipping to create a 200,000-ton deficit. At current rates, we will run out of petroleum reserves in 8 months. We will begin rationing food at levels that threaten civilian health within a year. This is not a defensive matter. This is survival." The meeting ended without resolution. Leigh's proposal was filed for further study. Further study meant indefinite delay. For 3 months, Leigh wrote memoranda. He compiled statistics. He documented every U-boat sighting that had escaped because aircraft could not attack at night. He calculated the tonnage that could have been saved, the lives that could have been spared, if his system had been deployed. The memoranda were acknowledged and ignored. Then Leigh received a summons he did not expect. The message came from the office of Professor Frederick Lindemann, scientific advisor to Winston Churchill himself. Lindemann, known as the professor in government circles, had heard about the searchlight trials through back channels. He wanted to see a demonstration. Leigh's pulse quickened as he read the summons. Lindemann had Churchill's ear on technical matters. If the prof supported the Leigh Light, doors that had been sealed shut might suddenly open. But Lindemann was also known for brutal assessments. He had destroyed careers with single sentences. Scientists and engineers feared his reviews more than enemy action. If he judged the Leigh Light impractical, the project would die permanently. Leigh had one chance. Everything depended on what happened next. The demonstration was scheduled for February 1942 at a Coastal Command airfield in Cornwall. Lindemann arrived with 2 assistants and a reputation for asking questions that exposed every weakness in any proposal. The night was overcast, with no moon. Visibility was zero without artificial illumination. Perfect hunting conditions for U-boats. Perfect testing conditions for Leigh. A Royal Navy submarine had been positioned 10 miles offshore, surfaced and stationary, playing the role of target. The submarine crew knew approximately when the aircraft would arrive, but not the exact time or approach angle. They were instructed to dive the moment they detected the attack, simulating combat conditions. Leigh sat in the modified Wellington bomber beside the pilot, Flight Lieutenant John Matthews. The aircraft carried no depth charges for this demonstration. Success would be measured by time. How many seconds of illumination could the aircraft achieve before the submarine submerged? Combat required at least 15 seconds for accurate weapon delivery. The aircraft took off at 2200 hours. Leigh watched the coastline disappear into blackness below. The ASV radar operator, Sergeant Collins, monitored his scope with intense concentration. The phosphorescent display showed only wave clutter and occasional fishing vessels. At 22:37 hours, Collins spoke. Contact bearing 275 degrees, range 12 miles, consistent with submarine profile. Matthews banked the Wellington toward the target. Leigh checked the searchlight controls. The system was armed. Power readings showed full charge. Everything functioned correctly. Range 8 miles, Collins reported. Target stationary. No change in bearing. Leigh's hands were steady, but his heart pounded. On the ground somewhere behind them, Lindemann watched through binoculars, waiting to see if a desk officer's idea could actually work under realistic conditions. Range 4 miles. Target still stationary. Matthews began descending to attack altitude. 3,000 feet. The aircraft engines droned steadily. Outside the cockpit windows, absolute darkness pressed against the glass. Range 2 miles. 1 mile, Collins called. Bearing steady. Leigh placed his finger on the searchlight switch. The submarine crew would hear the aircraft now. They would be scrambling for the hatch. The crash dive would begin in seconds. Activate, Matthews ordered. Leigh pressed the switch. For 2 heartbeats, nothing happened. The carbon arc required ignition time. Leigh felt his stomach drop. Had the system failed at the critical moment? Then light exploded from beneath the wing. The ocean's surface appeared in brilliant white illumination. And there, caught perfectly in the center of the beam, was the submarine. Leigh could see the conning tower clearly. He could see the wake from the submarine's initial movement as it began diving. He could see a figure still climbing down the hatch. The pilot adjusted course slightly to keep the target centered. The searchlight beam tracked across the water as the submarine accelerated its dive. Leigh counted silently. 1, 2, 3, 4. The conning tower began sinking beneath the waves. 8, 9, 10. The submarine's stern rose slightly as the bow angled downward. 15, 16, 17. The last portion of the conning tower disappeared. The beam now illuminated only churning water where the submarine had been. Matthews extinguished the searchlight and pulled the aircraft into a climbing turn. Total illumination time was 17 seconds, more than enough for a depth charge attack. When they landed, Lindemann was waiting on the tarmac. His face revealed nothing. Leigh descended from the aircraft and approached the scientist. 17 seconds, Leigh reported. Full illumination of target from activation until submergence. Lindemann nodded slowly. And the submarine crew knew you were coming. In actual combat, you would achieve surprise. Yes, sir. Real targets would have less warning. Lindemann was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. I will recommend immediate production to the Prime Minister. How many units can you deploy within 6 months? Leigh nearly collapsed with relief. If we receive priority allocation, sir, we could equip 40 aircraft by autumn. You will have your priority, Lindemann said. See that you deliver results. Within 2 weeks, Churchill personally endorsed the Leigh Light program. Manufacturing orders went to British Thomson Houston and General Electric facilities. Training programs began at Chivanor for dedicated squadrons. The bureaucratic obstacles that had blocked progress for months evaporated overnight. But approval was only the beginning of Leigh's challenges. Production required components that were scarce throughout wartime Britain. The carbon electrodes alone consumed materials needed for other military applications. The mirror assemblies demanded precision manufacturing that few facilities could provide. The electrical systems required copper wiring at a time when copper was worth nearly its weight in gold. Leigh found himself fighting a new battle, not against skeptical admirals, but against competing procurement priorities. Every component he needed, someone else needed more urgently. He traveled constantly. Factory floors in Birmingham, research facilities in Cambridge, maintenance depots across southern England. He learned to negotiate, to trade favors, to find solutions when official channels provided only obstacles. The first operational Leigh Light aircraft became available in June 1942. Squadron 172 at Chivanor received initial equipment. The crews had trained for months, practicing the complex choreography of radar-guided approach followed by visual attack. Flight Lieutenant James Wright commanded one of the first operational patrols. On June 4, 1942, his Wellington detected a surfaced contact in the Bay of Biscay. The radar operator guided the approach. At 1 mile, Wright activated the Leigh Light. The Italian submarine Luigi Torelli appeared in perfect illumination. Wright released depth charges. The explosions bracketed the submarine, causing severe damage. Luigi Torelli survived, limping back to port with cracked pressure hull and flooded compartments. But the attack proved the system worked in actual combat. Over the following weeks, more attacks followed. More submarines were damaged. Some were destroyed. German naval intelligence began receiving reports they could not explain. U-boat commanders described attacks from aircraft that appeared without warning in complete darkness. Searchlights brighter than anything they had encountered. Depth charges falling with impossible accuracy. The Germans theorized about infrared detection. They suspected advanced radar. They issued countermeasures that proved worthless because they misunderstood the threat completely. By December 1942, Coastal Command operated 18 Leigh Light aircraft. They had conducted over 200 night patrols. They had attacked 14 submarines. They had achieved 4 confirmed kills and 7 probable kills. The numbers were encouraging, but not yet decisive. 18 aircraft could not cover the entire Atlantic. U-boats still surfaced at night in areas beyond patrol range. The Battle of the Atlantic remained desperately close. Leigh knew that success required scale. 40 aircraft, then 80, then over 100. Only overwhelming coverage could transform the night from sanctuary into killing ground. Production accelerated through early 1943. More squadrons received equipment. More crews completed training. By May 1943, approximately 40 Leigh Light aircraft were operational, with more entering service monthly. And then something extraordinary happened. In May 1943, Allied forces sank 41 German U-boats. It was the highest monthly total of the entire war. Leigh Light aircraft contributed directly to many of these kills. But more importantly, the threat of night illumination forced all German submarines to change their behavior. Admiral Donitz issued emergency orders. No more routine surface charging at night. Submarines must remain submerged longer. Cross the Bay of Biscay underwater. Surface only when absolutely necessary, and only after confirming no aircraft nearby. These restrictions crippled U-boat operational effectiveness. Submarines designed for surface speed now crawled submerged at 7 knots. Boats that once patrolled for weeks now exhausted batteries in days. The mathematics of submarine warfare shifted decisively toward the Allies. But the Germans were not defeated yet. In June 1943, German intelligence finally captured a British aircrew whose damaged Wellington had crashed near the French coast. Under interrogation, the crew revealed the Leigh Light's existence. For the first time, German Naval Command understood exactly what they faced. Admiral Donitz summoned his technical staff. He demanded countermeasures. He ordered research into detection systems that could warn submarines before the light activated. He commanded development of anti-aircraft weapons specifically designed to engage illuminating aircraft. The Germans had lost the element of surprise that had protected their submarines. Now they would fight back. And the real battle was about to begin. In Part 3, you will watch the technological arms race accelerate. You will see German engineers develop radar warning receivers that detected approaching aircraft minutes before attack. You will witness U-boat commanders ordered to stay surfaced and fight rather than dive, turning hunting aircraft into targets themselves. You will learn how 11 Coastal Command aircraft were shot down by submarines they thought were helpless prey. And you will return to Captain Lieutenant Hesse, still commanding U-640, as he prepares for a patrol into the Bay of Biscay with new weapons, new tactics, and orders to kill the aircraft that had once nearly killed him. The hunters were becoming the hunted. But in this war, the hunted had teeth. Let me remind you where we are. A 53-year-old administrative officer named Humphrey Lee invented a searchlight that could illuminate submarines from 3,000 feet. The military establishment rejected him for months. Churchill's scientific advisor finally saw the demonstration and approved immediate production. By May 1943, 40 aircraft carried Leigh Lights over the Atlantic and Bay of Biscay. In that single month, Allied forces sank 41 German U-boats, the highest monthly total of the entire war. But then German intelligence captured a British aircrew. Under interrogation, they revealed everything: the searchlight, the tactics, the frequencies. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of all German submarine forces, now knew exactly what was killing his boats. And he was about to fight back with everything Germany had. Here is a number that changed the war. In June 1943, German U-boats shot down 11 Coastal Command aircraft, 11 bombers, 66 aircrew killed. Not by fighters, not by anti-aircraft batteries on land, by submarines. The hunters had become the hunted, and the hunted had learned to bite. This was no longer an experiment. This was total war. Donitz moved fast. Within days of receiving intelligence about the Leigh Light, he issued new tactical orders to every U-boat in the Atlantic. The orders were radical. They contradicted everything German submariners had learned since the war began. Do not dive when attacked at night. Stay surfaced. Fight. The logic was brutal but sound. A diving submarine was helpless. It took 45 seconds to get the conning tower underwater, another 60 seconds to reach safe depth. During that time, the boat could not shoot back. It could only pray that depth charges missed. But a surfaced submarine carried weapons. Type 7 C boats mounted a 20mm anti-aircraft cannon on the conning tower. Some carried quad 20mm installations. A few had been retrofitted with 37mm guns, capable of destroying aircraft at considerable range. If U-boat crews could shoot down the attacking aircraft before depth charges were released, they survived. If they dove, they died in illuminated water. Dönitz calculated that aggressive defense would cost fewer submarines than passive evasion. The mathematics favored fighting. German shipyards accelerated modifications. U-boats returning from patrol had additional anti-aircraft weapons installed. Ammunition storage increased. Crews received training in aerial gunnery that had never been part of submarine doctrine. The Bay of Biscay transformed into something German sailors began calling Todesfälle, the Valley of Death. Every transit between French bases and Atlantic hunting grounds became a battle. Aircraft attacked. Submarines fought back. Both sides took casualties. British intelligence noted the change immediately. Patrol reports that had described submarines diving frantically now described submarines remaining surfaced and firing. Aircraft that had attacked with impunity now faced tracers arcing up through the searchlight beam. Flight Lieutenant Robert Harrison of Squadron 172 described an attack in July 1943. We illuminated a Type 7 about 10 miles west of Brest. Standard approach. Good radar contact. Perfect light activation. The submarine was centered in the beam at about 2,500 feet slant range. Then the tracers started, green and white, coming straight at us. I could hear rounds hitting the fuselage. The co-pilot was wounded in the leg. We released depth charges, but I had to break off before confirming hits. The boat was still firing when we lost visual contact. The submarine Harrison attacked was U-441. It survived. His Wellington limped back to base with 17 bullet holes and 1 wounded crewman. But this was only one aspect of German adaptation. Dönitz also ordered development of radar warning receivers specifically tuned to British ASV frequencies. German engineers worked around the clock. By August 1943, new detectors called Naxos entered service. These devices could detect approaching aircraft at ranges up to 30 miles, giving submarines several minutes warning before attack. With warning came options. Dive early and avoid illumination entirely, or prepare defenses and engage the aircraft. Either choice was better than being caught by surprise. The technological advantage Lee had created was eroding. German countermeasures were working. Aircraft losses mounted. Submarine kills declined. But this was not the only crisis facing Leigh Light operations. As production scaled from dozens to hundreds of units, quality problems emerged. The carbon arc lamps that had performed perfectly in small batches began failing at higher rates. Electrodes that should have lasted 45 minutes burned out in 20. Mirror assemblies cracked under thermal stress. Electrical systems overloaded and started fires. In September 1943, a Wellington from Squadron 179 caught fire during a patrol when its Leigh Light electrical system shorted. The aircraft crashed into the Bay of Biscay. All 6 crew members died. Investigation revealed manufacturing defects in the power coupling that had passed quality inspection. 2 weeks later, another aircraft lost its Leigh Light to electrode failure at the critical moment of attack. The pilot had guided the Wellington to within 1 mile of a surfaced submarine. He activated the searchlight. Nothing happened. The submarine dove safely while the crew struggled with dead equipment. Questions arose. Had the program expanded too quickly? Were corners being cut in manufacturing? Should production slow until quality improved? Some voices in the Air Ministry suggested scaling back. The losses were becoming difficult to justify. German countermeasures seemed to be winning. Perhaps the resources devoted to Leigh Light operations should be redirected to other priorities. Lee defended his system fiercely. The problems were manufacturing issues, not design flaws. Quality control could be improved. The solution was better production, not abandonment. But even Lee had moments of doubt. In private correspondence, later discovered in his personal papers, he wrote to his wife in September 1943, "Some nights I wonder if I have sent good men to die for an idea that cannot work at scale. The Germans adapt faster than we improve. Every failure feels personal." The critics grew louder. The program needed a decisive victory to silence them. It came on the night of November 7, 1943. Squadron 172 had received new aircraft, modified Wellington Mark 14 bombers with improved Leigh Light installations, and upgraded ASV Mark III radar. The quality problems had been addressed. The crews had trained specifically for the new German fighting tactics. Flight Lieutenant Kenneth Moore commanded the lead aircraft of a coordinated patrol. 3 Wellingtons would sweep adjacent sectors of the Bay of Biscay simultaneously. If one aircraft made contact, the others would converge. Multiple illumination angles, overlapping depth charge patterns, overwhelming force against any submarine that chose to fight. Moore's aircraft detected the surface contact at 22:47 hours. Radar signature consistent with submarine. Range 14 miles. Bearing 285 degrees. Course northeast at approximately 12 knots. Moore radioed the other aircraft. Contact confirmed, converging. The approach took 6 minutes. Moore descended to 2,500 feet. The other Wellingtons positioned themselves at different angles, creating a triangle around the estimated target position. At 1 mile range, Moore activated his Leigh Light. U-966 appeared in brilliant illumination. A Type 7C returning from patrol. The submarine's anti-aircraft crew was already at their weapons. Tracers erupted from the conning tower immediately. Moore pressed the attack. Depth charges released. The Wellington shuddered as rounds struck the fuselage. The navigator was hit. Moore felt something slam into his seatback. The depth charges fell. Moore broke hard right as explosions erupted below. 20 seconds later, the second Wellington activated its light. U-966 was still surfaced, still firing, but visibly damaged. Oil spread across the water. The conning tower listed to port. More depth charges fell. More explosions. The third Wellington made its run. By now, U-966's guns had fallen silent. The submarine was sinking by the stern. Figures appeared on the conning tower. Men jumping into the water. Moore circled at safe distance, watching. The submarine's bow rose vertically. It hung there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it slid beneath the surface and was gone. 44 men had been aboard U-966. British destroyers rescued 11 survivors the following morning. The rest had drowned or died in the explosions. Moore's aircraft had taken 37 hits. The navigator died of his wounds before reaching base. But the mission had proven that coordinated Leigh Light attacks could defeat German fighting tactics. Within weeks, Coastal Command adopted the multi-aircraft approach as standard procedure. Single illuminations gave way to coordinated strikes. Submarines that surfaced to fight found themselves illuminated from multiple angles simultaneously. The German fighting doctrine collapsed. Submarines that stayed surfaced were destroyed by overwhelming attacks. Submarines that dove were caught by single aircraft before they reached safe depth. There was no good option. By December 1943, U-boat commanders had abandoned the fighting tactic. Losses were unsustainable. Of the submarines that attempted to engage aircraft in the Bay of Biscay during autumn 1943, over 60% had been sunk or severely damaged. The survival rate for diving had become better than the survival rate for fighting. Donitz issued new orders. Do not engage aircraft. Dive immediately upon detection. Cross the Bay of Biscay submerged whenever possible. These orders effectively conceded the night to Allied aircraft. The statistics told the story. In June 1943, when German submarines first began fighting back, they shot down 11 Allied aircraft. In December 1943, they shot down 2. Meanwhile, Leigh Light equipped aircraft sank or damaged 23 submarines in December alone. The Bay of Biscay had become a killing ground, but now it killed Germans. News of the coordinated attack tactics spread rapidly through Coastal Command. Squadrons that had operated independently began practicing multi-aircraft approaches. Training programs incorporated lessons from Moore's mission. The success bred more success. The psychological impact on German submariners was devastating. Interrogations of captured crew members revealed profound changes in morale. One petty officer from a submarine sunk in January 1944 told British intelligence officers that crews had begun calling Bay of Biscay patrols suicide missions. Men who had volunteered enthusiastically in 1941 and 1942 now invented excuses to avoid assignment to operational boats. The German Navy's casualty rate became impossible to hide. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, over 30,000 would die. A 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. The majority of these deaths occurred after mid-1943, when Leigh Light operations reached full effectiveness. Admiral Donitz knew his submarine fleet was being destroyed. He continued sending boats on patrol because Germany had no alternative strategy for threatening British supply lines. But he understood that each patrol cost more submarines than it sank enemy ships. The exchange rate had reversed completely. In 1942, Germany lost one submarine for approximately every 15 merchant ships sunk. By early 1944, Germany lost one submarine for every 3 merchant ships sunk. The mathematics of attrition now favored Britain decisively. Humphrey Lee received the Distinguished Flying Cross in February 1944. The citation recognized his contribution to anti-submarine warfare, but revealed few details due to continued operational security. He continued improving the Leigh Light system through the war's final years. Later variants produced even greater illumination from higher altitudes. Some aircraft carried dual installations for redundancy. The technology that had seemed impossible in 1940 had become standard equipment by 1944. But Lee himself remained largely unknown. He was not a pilot or a commander. He did not lead men into battle. He was an inventor, a bureaucratic fighter, a man who had created something from nothing and then watched others use it to change history. The war in the Atlantic was won. The Leigh Light had played a crucial role in winning it. Over 17,000 patrols, 43 confirmed submarine kills, nearly 100 additional submarines damaged, countless merchant ships saved, tens of thousands of sailors who returned home instead of drowning in cold Atlantic water. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? What does history remember? And what does it forget? In Part 4, we will follow Humphrey Lee through the war's final years and into the peace that followed. You will learn what became of the technology he created, You will discover how the Leigh Light influenced weapons development for decades afterward. And you will understand why a man who saved thousands of lives remained almost completely unknown for the rest of his life. This story has one final chapter, and it may be the most important one of all. Let me take you back to where this journey began. A 53-year-old administrative officer with no engineering degree sketched an idea on a notepad. What if we brought daylight with us? The military establishment laughed. Senior officers called it impossible. Engineers said the physics would not work. For months, his proposal gathered dust, while German submarines sank millions of tons of Allied shipping. But Humphrey Leigh refused to surrender. He built a prototype with his own hands. He demonstrated it to Churchill's scientific advisor. He fought bureaucrats harder than pilots fought submarines. And by May 1943, his invention had helped sink 41 U-boats in a single month, the highest total of the entire war. The Leigh Light transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from near defeat into decisive victory. It saved countless ships and tens of thousands of lives. It proved that one stubborn man with a good idea could change the course of history. But what happened to that man when the guns fell silent? This story has a twist that nobody expected, because success sometimes comes with a price that history books never mention. And the price Humphrey Leigh paid was invisibility. When World War II ended in May 1945, Humphrey Leigh was 58 years old. He had spent 5 years fighting 2 wars simultaneously. The first against German submarines, the second against his own military bureaucracy. He had won both, but the victories left different marks. The Leigh Light had become standard equipment across coastal command. Over 400 units had been manufactured. More than 17,000 patrols had been flown using his invention. 43 confirmed U-boat kills were attributed directly to Leigh Light attacks, with nearly 100 additional submarines damaged severely enough to abort their patrols. Yet when the war ended, Leigh received no promotion, no knighthood, no mention in the major histories being written about the Atlantic campaign. He had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in 1944, a significant honor, but one typically given to combat pilots rather than inventors. The citation praised his contribution to anti-submarine warfare without explaining what that contribution actually was. Leigh retired from the Royal Air Force in 1946 at the rank of Wing Commander. It was a respectable rank, but hardly one that reflected his impact on the war. Men who had commanded single squadrons received higher recognition. Admirals who had implemented tactics developed by others became celebrated figures. Leigh became a footnote. He returned to civilian life quietly. He worked as an aviation consultant for several British companies, applying his technical knowledge to peacetime problems. He lived in modest circumstances in southern England with his wife, who had supported him through years of frustration and finally triumph. In interviews conducted decades later, Leigh expressed no bitterness about his lack of recognition. He told one researcher in 1968 that he had never sought fame. The satisfaction came from knowing the work mattered, from knowing that ships reached port because of something he had created. But there were moments when the anonymity clearly stung. In 1960, a major documentary about the Battle of the Atlantic aired on BBC television. It featured extensive footage of coastal command operations. It showed aircraft attacking submarines at night. It mentioned technological innovations that had turned the tide. It never once mentioned Humphrey Leigh or his searchlight. Leigh wrote a letter to the BBC requesting a correction. The letter was acknowledged, but no correction was made. The documentary was rebroadcast multiple times over the following years. Each time, the man who had invented the technology shown on screen remained unnamed. His colleagues from wartime scattered across the post-war world. Some became successful businessmen. Some remained in military service. A few wrote memoirs that mentioned the Leigh Light in passing, usually without attributing it to any individual inventor. Squadron leader Kenneth Moore, who had commanded the coordinated attack that proved multi-aircraft tactics could defeat German defenses, received a distinguished service order and eventually rose to Air Commodore. He credited the Leigh Light in his personal papers, but focused his public statements on crew bravery rather than technology. Humphrey Leigh died on March 1, 1975, at age 87. His obituary in the Times ran just 6 paragraphs. It mentioned his distinguished flying cross. It mentioned his work on aviation lighting systems. It did not mention that his invention had helped win the most critical naval campaign of the Second World War. But the legacy of a man is not measured only in headlines or monuments. The Leigh Light's technical principles outlived its inventor by decades. The concept of aircraft-mounted searchlights for maritime patrol became standard doctrine across NATO forces during the Cold War. American, British, Canadian, and Australian patrol aircraft carried illumination systems derived directly from Leigh's original design. The technology evolved. Carbon arc lamps gave way to xenon lights in the 1960s. Xenon yielded to infrared systems in the 1970s. Modern maritime patrol aircraft carry illumination equipment that would seem magical to Leigh. Lasers and night vision and thermal imaging that can detect a submarine's heat signature from miles away. Yet every one of these systems traces its conceptual lineage to a simple question asked in 1940. What if we brought daylight with us? The tactical framework Leigh developed proved equally durable. The coordinated multi-aircraft attacks that defeated German fighting tactics became the template for anti-submarine operations in Korea, Vietnam, and countless exercises during the Cold War. When American aircraft hunted Soviet submarines during the long decades of nuclear standoff, they used procedures refined from Leigh Light operations. The statistics compiled after the war revealed the full scope of what Leigh had accomplished. Coastal Command's official history, published in 1957, credited Leigh Light operations with preventing the loss of approximately 500 merchant ships between 1942 and 1945. At average crew sizes, this represented roughly 15,000 sailors who reached home ports instead of drowning in the Atlantic. 15,000 lives. That was Humphrey Leigh's legacy. Not medals or monuments, but 15,000 men who survived because a desk officer refused to accept that night attacks were impossible. The German perspective confirmed the impact. Post-war interrogations of surviving U-boat commanders revealed that Leigh Light attacks had fundamentally broken submarine morale. One captain told American intelligence officers that after experiencing illumination at night, he never felt safe surfacing again. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the depth charges. Admiral Donitz himself, in memoirs written after his release from Spandau prison, acknowledged that Allied air power had defeated his submarine campaign. He specifically mentioned night attacks as the factor his forces could not overcome. He did not name the Leigh Light, but his meaning was clear. But the real lesson of Humphrey Leigh's story transcends technology and tactics. Consider what he actually accomplished. A man with no engineering credentials solved a problem that professional engineers had declared unsolvable. An administrative officer changed military doctrine that combat commanders insisted could not change. A 53-year-old bureaucrat outlasted opposition from men half his age with twice his authority. How did he do it? The answer lies not in genius, but in persistence. Leigh was not smarter than the engineers who rejected his proposal. He simply refused to accept their rejection. He built the prototype himself when no one would build it for him. He demonstrated results when arguments failed. He found allies when his direct superiors blocked his path. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The tank was rejected by cavalry officers who could not imagine warfare without horses. Radar was dismissed by admirals who trusted lookouts more than electronics. Aircraft carriers were opposed by battleship commanders who believed big guns would always dominate sea warfare. In every case, the innovation succeeded not because it was obviously superior, but because someone refused to stop pushing until the evidence became undeniable. The institutional resistance Leigh faced was not malicious. The officers who rejected his proposal were not stupid or corrupt. They were professionals making reasonable decisions based on experience and available information. Night anti-submarine operations had failed repeatedly. Resources were desperately scarce. The safe choice was to invest in proven systems rather than experimental ones. This is why innovation is so difficult in large organizations. The same expertise that makes institutions effective also makes them resistant to change. The people best qualified to evaluate new ideas are often the people most invested in old methods. Leigh overcame this resistance through what might be called strategic stubbornness. He did not argue louder. He did not complain about unfairness. He simply kept working, kept demonstrating, kept finding new paths when old ones closed. Eventually, the evidence accumulated until rejection became impossible. This lesson applies far beyond military history. Every entrepreneur who disrupted an industry faced similar resistance from established experts. Every scientist who overturned accepted theory endured years of dismissal from colleagues. Every reformer who changed social norms was first called naive, or dangerous, or insane. The pattern is universal. Good ideas face rejection. Persistence determines which ideas survive. And there is one final detail about Humphrey Leigh that almost nobody knows. In 1986, 11 years after Leigh's death, researchers at the Imperial War Museum began cataloging materials donated by his widow. Among his personal papers, they discovered a notebook from 1941. The notebook contained calculations, diagrams, and design sketches for the Leigh Light. But it also contained something else. Pressed between the pages were 3 photographs. The first showed a young Humphrey Leigh in Royal Flying Corps uniform during World War I, standing beside a biplane on a French airfield. The second showed his wife on their wedding day in 1922. The third showed something unexpected. It was a photograph of a merchant ship, the SS Dorrington Court, taken from a newspaper clipping dated November 1943. The ship had been part of a convoy attacked by U-boats in the Bay of Biscay. According to the clipping, the attack had been broken off when aircraft arrived and illuminated the submarines, forcing them to dive before they could sink any vessels. On the back of the photograph, in Leigh's handwriting, were written 4 words. "This is why I tried." Leigh had kept that photograph for over 30 years. Through all the rejections, all the bureaucratic battles, all the technical problems and quality failures, and mounting casualties, he had kept a picture of one ship that survived because his invention worked. Not statistics, not tonnage numbers, not strategic assessments. One ship, one crew. Men he never met, whose names he never knew. Sailing home to families who never learned why they arrived safely. That was what mattered to Humphrey Leigh. That was why he fought. From a desk officer with an idea everyone called impossible, to a weapon that changed the most critical battle of World War II. Humphrey de Leigh proved that innovation does not require genius or authority or permission. It requires only the refusal to stop trying when the answer matters enough. His searchlight flew over 17,000 patrols. It contributed to the destruction of more than 140 German submarines. It saved approximately 500 ships and 15,000 lives. And it demonstrated a principle that remains true in every field where humans struggle against impossible problems. The night only belongs to darkness until someone decides to bring their own light. If you found this story inspiring, you should know it is only one of hundreds of similar stories from World War II. Men and women who saw problems everyone else accepted, who proposed solutions everyone else rejected, who persisted until they changed the world. Share in the comments if you know another story like this. Subscribe to discover more history that most people have never heard. And remember the lesson of Humphrey Leigh. When someone tells you your idea is impossible, the only question that matters is whether you believe it is worth trying anyway. Because sometimes, one stubborn person with one good idea is all it takes to turn darkness into light.